So how do psychologists develop a questionnaire? First, start with theory, define the concept that's going to be measured, and that sounds straightforward enough to do, and something that really should be fundamental to any research process. But because we can't easily see psychological concepts, providing a definition can be difficult. And it's normal in the psychological literature for there to be a number of different competing definitions, and that you can't see it means that people can construct different views of that concept, leading to different definitions. And some of these definitions can be extremely contradictory. So as a consequence of having contradictory definitions, you're likely to have different views on how that concept should be measured. So when looking at the validity of a measure, it's really important to look at the theory that it's supposed to be measuring, because that is the tool that's going to be used to test that theory. So the properties of a psychometric questionnaire, and here is a list of the things that need to be done. There's content validity, face validity, factorial validity, criterion validity, which has got at least two different parts, concurrent and predictive, test-retest reliability or test-retest stability, internal consistency, and normative data. And psychologists would like to have followed all of those procedures and demonstrated validity in all those areas when saying that a questionnaire is valid. So let's look at some of the different types of validity. Content validity. This is the degree to which a test provides an adequate sample of a particular content domain, and it's normally determined through a qualitative process. In other words, you won't find a single statistic that says this has content validity. And the common approach to determining this is to use a group of experts. The experts will say, well, we're looking to assess anxiety, for example, and so what do we need to assess anxiety? And they'll pull in a number of different ways of doing that, suggest a few questions, and take that forwards. Face validity. This describes the extent to which participants from the target population can understand the items, and it's a really important step, I think, in the demonstration of validity, because they're the people who are going to be completing the questionnaire, and if they can't understand what the items are saying, then you really have trouble. And it might well be that it's to do with the words that are used. And when we developed the Brunel mood scale, we asked school children whether they understood the meaning of the items, and we started with a scale that was developed for an American population, and some of the items were you understood what they meant, such as grovely, but school children in the 90s were not so familiar with such terms. And there's also the item sad was on there, and at that time sad was sort of seen as uncool, so we were getting people calling each other sad and stuff like that, and which was having its different meaning. So it's important to check with people what's going on with sort of cultural aspects, subcultural aspects, to see whether that what you think your questionnaire is assessing is actually assessing what it's supposed to. So face validity, really important aspect. Factorial validity. This is where the statisticians get excited. It involves where you collect larger amounts of data, you give the questionnaire out to hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of people, and then perform something called a factor analysis. There are different types of factor analysis. One is an exploratory one. This is where the computer generates the factor structure. So you chuck the items in and a factor structure will emerge, accounting for a certain amount of the variance. The other option is a confirmatory factor analysis. This is where the researcher says these items will describe these factors. Confirmatory is the preferred method since the 90s, where exploratory got a really bad press for a while, called an uncharted romp through a correlation matrix, which I got quite excited about. I know most of you think that doesn't mean absolutely anything, but the idea that exploratory factor analysis was a really good way of creating new concepts, but these may well be mathematical artifacts, and confirmatory factor analysis suddenly seemed to be theory testing, and that seemed to hold a lot of lot of positive ways for the future of developing the factorial analysis of a scale. So it's really important to get the factorial validity right, because this is what's used to add up the factor structure. So the 4 items in each factor in the POMS, which are the Brunel mood scale which you've been looking at, are derived through this process. It says these items are measuring a similar concept, and therefore you can add them up to get a reasonably clean assessment of that concept. So important to get that right. Test-retest reliability, really important to determine your test-retest reliability, especially when doing intervention work. What you want to know is that any differences over time or after following a treatment of some type is true to meaningful changes and not due to the measurement tool just randomly giving you a score which is different. If we had a set of scales, we'd want to know that we get the same score each time if the person hasn't lost any weight, for example. So if we measured ourselves now and then measured ourselves 10 minutes later, we'd expect to get the same score. We've talked about self-report scales being estimates. We've talked about people not having true knowledge of how they're feeling, so there may well be some true variation between test-retest calculations, and what we want to do is be able to have that as minimal as possible, so that if there is a real difference, we can say that's due to some meaningful changes. Normative data. This is really important. It's often overlooked by researchers. Certainly in the sports psychology literature, there are few scales that end up with normative data, which is a shame really, because what norms do is allow you to know what the average is, and when you've got large sample sizes, it's a way of interpreting those scores. And with the Brunel scale which we've been looking at, what we know is that very low scores on some of the unpleasant emotions, such as depression, is the norm, and therefore if you get a score of 1 or 2 on a range from 0 to 16, this actually is quite a high score. So small scores of depression are very different to what most people get, and so it does mean that the researcher or practitioner has got some insight into how the questionnaire behaves with different people. So I think they're really useful. I think we should be looking for normative data. It's not the only way, of course, of interpreting the scales. You can look at your own scores on a previous occasion. If you completed the tension score on the Brums and got a score of 8, which says you're reasonably tense, and then in another competition, before another competition, you got a score of 9, then that is only one difference, only a marginal score. If you got a score of 2 one week and a score of 9 the next week, then there's an enormous difference. So it's the interpretation against your own previous scores offers a really nice way of interpreting the score. So look for norms in questionnaires. They are a really useful way of describing the data you've got. They're often converted to something called T-scores, which is a way of producing the data where 50 is the average, and the normal range, the standard deviation, is 10, so most people will score between 40 and 60. Okay, in summary, there are limitations in all questionnaires, but they do provide a really useful way of gaining insight into people's psychological traits and states. But be cautious when using them. Accept that there'll be some noise in the data, and the validity of self-report scales is often a lengthy process. So in dismissing them as not being very good, just think through very carefully that these researchers have gone to some great lengths in order to try and produce something that is valid and reliable, which just illustrates how difficult a task it can be.